It's here, finally, what we've all been waiting for. No, it's not Firestorm, sadly, but I'm instead talking about Rush. Okay, maybe everyone hasn't been waiting for Rush, but I do think it's a super popular mode with the Battlefield franchise, and a lot of players have been really looking forward to Rush because for a load of people it's how they were first introduced to Battlefield back in Bad Company days. Now Rush has had a bit of a bad time recently though. In BF1 it really was not that well received. It was limited to 24 players and overall just really slow and boring, to be honest with you. The maps never quite felt as though they worked that well either, which is a real shame because Rush used to be one of the better game modes in the Battlefield series. We had already had a brief glimpse at Rush during the newest Grand Operation that released called Hanut, but that was 64 players, horrible, whereas the actual Rush game mode is limited to 32 players this time around. And from what I've played so far, I think that's a decent amount. So how is it in BF5 then? Well, I quite like the Rush mode, I think it's fun. It very much feels like Frontlines in a lot of ways, and while it always felt like there were players around to fight, it never felt empty or felt like there were too many people and there was just no way that I was going to get to the MCOM. It felt like a good balance to me. It's also only on 3 maps right now, which is a shame. Definitely going to put a few people off. Devastation, Twisted Steel and Narvik are the only maps that have been given the Rush treatment so far, but the question is, providing it's quality over quantity, will players mind? The only issue is that players who really do love Rush will get a bit bored of the same 3 maps over and over again. I think Twisted Steel is probably the best one out of the 3, but I do enjoy Frontlines on that map too. Me personally, I've done the Tides of War assignment now, unlocked the new gun, and I think I've got a bit more Rush in me on those 3 maps, but not much more than that. So then, let's talk about one of the biggest issues that I think Rush has right now, and amazingly it's not Rush itself. Let me explain. This week, BF5 also added in 2 new squad reinforcements that squad leaders can call in. One of those reinforcements is the artillery barrage. You use it much like you do with a V1 rocket, call it into a location, and it will drop down a pretty hefty barrage of artillery. It's like a more extreme version of the artillery you could have when using an MCOM in BF1, for example, or more similar to something like the PUBG Red Zone, let's say. Now I think there are quite a few issues with the artillery though. First of all, you really get no warning or notification as a player that it's going to happen or where it's going to happen apart from red smoke on the ground before it starts. I know that may sound counterintuitive, you wouldn't actually have a notification to tell you a tank is going to shoot you, but this is quite a large artillery barrage. I don't think some sort of warning either on the minimap or audio cue saying artillery is coming into your position would be a big issue either. The other problem is that, as with V1 rockets, when you get towards the end of the game, these call-ins become way more frequent. The artillery costs around 17,000 squad reinforcement points, and while that might seem like a lot, it actually isn't, especially if the Rush game mode goes on for quite a bit. You end up in a bit of a loop where multiple squads, both defending and attacking, are dropping in artillery barrages quite regularly, and that becomes a frustrating gameplay loop to me. The artillery barrage itself doesn't really do that much damage to you, but I don't think the damage is the problem. It's just the amount of screen shake and noise that it creates. And I know that some players might think, well, that's just adding atmosphere, constant fire and explosions going off. It does feel cool in some regards, but from a gameplay perspective, that doesn't always tally up. The other issue, and this is a big problem, is the screen shake like I just mentioned. If you're close to an artillery barrage when it comes in, your screen will shake beyond all comprehension, making aiming, the most important thing in the game, incredibly hard and honestly annoying. Again, I understand that some players might say, well, if you were in a real artillery barrage, you wouldn't be able to shoot your gun either, but I would kindly remind those people that this is a video game and it should be fun, and that kind of stuff is just frustrating to most people. And what's even more frustrating, I think, is that in BF1 we actually had a screen shake slider implemented, and I saw a conversation on Twitter where JJJU, one of the devs on the game, said that he could add that into BF5 in no time at all if he was instructed to do so, but it's not his place as it's a core gameplay decision. The point I'm trying to make is that the functionality is there to reduce the screen shake significantly if DICE decide to adopt it. I honestly see no reason not to, because if you added it into BF1, why not let us have it in BF5 too? Who wants the highest amount of screen shake, really? Is there someone out there who actually wants that level of immersion to the point where it just becomes frustrating? Maybe there is, but if there was a slider, I think at least people could choose, and most people would choose to whack it all the way down to 0. So this may be controversial, but what if these sort of squad call-ins were disabled in the smaller game modes? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing, do you think? The artillery barrage really isn't a problem in larger game modes, especially Conquest, because everything's so spread out, but it's way more effective and noticeable in the smaller game modes where players are forced to group up together and the maps are smaller. So what if in, let's say, Rush, Frontlines, artillery wasn't available and the larger attacking call-ins such as V1s were held back for Grand Operations and Conquest? I just personally think that Rush would be a better experience without the artillery barrage, but that's just my opinion. I'm not sure DICE would ever disable it for smaller modes, especially as it's only just been added to the game, but just in general, I don't really like those sorts of things on these smaller game modes, but subjective, just the way I feel. And let's talk briefly about the smoke barrage too. This one's a lot cheaper to call in than the artillery barrage, costing 7,000, and on paper this one sounds incredibly useful. On game modes such as Rush, Frontlines or Breakthrough, where you've got multiple players and squads all trying to push close objectives, it has tons of potential to aid team play and attacks. I don't think it's quite good enough though in its actual implementation in BF5. In fact, the smoke itself doesn't even really seem to be that thick. The layer of smoke it puts down is good, but it's not quite a wall of smoke that I was expecting. So if I were in charge, I'd definitely give the smoke barrage a bit more of a plume and more volume to make it more useful. That being said, I have seen it used quite a bit in Rush, and if you combine it with infantry smokes, it's an effective tool, and that's good to see. Bit of team play. Overall, I've enjoyed Rush in BF5, but I think there are a few things holding it back from being a really great mode. One of those is the artillery that I've already mentioned, but there are some quite questionable placement of objectives too, and the mode doesn't quite work as well as it did, say, back in Bad Company 2 or BF3. There's a really interesting Reddit thread at the moment talking about map boundaries on Rush and how they were in BF5 and BF1 compared to previous games, and I do tend to agree with it. In Bad Company 2 and 3, maps were designed with Rush in mind from the ground up. They offered up linear experiences where defenders could place themselves in numerous defensive positions and attackers had to really push forward to capture objectives. Rush in BF1 and 5 has lost a bit of that. Instead, it's a little less linear, which for the most part should be a good thing, but there often doesn't seem like there's much of a push to capture objectives, and defenders don't really have multiple lines of defense. I think that we could see some improvements to Rush if it came back down the line, as remember, for some reason this is a limited time mode only. Such a shame that Rush has turned into this, but there you go. But I think really, if they want to make Rush a popular game mode and make it something that's sought after and of value, then really they've got to start changing the geometry. I've said this for years, ever since BF4 just started plonking MCOMs down on existing Conquest maps. If you're going to make Rush good again, you've got to make maps from it with the ground up, with Rush in mind, or go into the existing maps and completely change around the geometry, because I think the way they're doing it at the moment is just severely limiting its potential as a game mode. And wrapping things up, this week's Tides of War assignment is live, and this time you can unlock the Mesquita Fb Mark 6. This plane is really interesting because it has the biggest bomb that you can have in a plane in BF5 at the moment. It's a 4,000 pound bomb as one of the top specialization unlocks. Not only that, but the QF6 PDR anti-tank cannon, again a specialization unlock, is extremely good at taking down enemy bombers. In fact, it makes light work of them, and it looks damn good while it's doing it too. I've seen them being one shot by this thing. Of course, you can use it against tanks too, because that's what it's designed for. Thankfully, unlocking this plane is not very tricky at all. I just did it in a few rounds of Rush, and first of all you need to play one round of Rush, easy enough, and the tree allows you to take a few different routes, making your life pretty easy. To be honest, it's all pretty straightforward. The final step is to earn 25,000 score in Rush, and depending on how long the games last, you can probably do this in 1 or 2 rounds. Get that all done and the plane is yours. Of course, if you really don't want to bother, then just wait and it'll become available eventually to purchase for company coins soon enough. So there we have it, the new Rush game mode. That's not going to stay around forever, so if you want to experience it, hop on now before it leaves for who knows how long. I think it's good. Certainly better than what we had in BF1, but it can definitely be improved, especially if the artillery barrage perhaps has some looking into, and a camera shake slider. DICE, please, come on, don't do me like this, man. Ultimately, it's a bit bittersweet for me because I just miss the days of Bad Company 2 and BF3 Rush, where some of the maps were really tailor-made for that game mode, and you were changing elevations and it was all focused towards those 2 objectives. I don't think we're going to get that in BF5, but maybe the next game, we'll see. And that's all, guys.
I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, leave a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.